All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a piece of history that's honestly mind-blowing. We're talking about a massive 200-year clash that completely shaped the balance of power in early medieval North India. It's an epic story of wild imperial ambition, some crazy geographical irony, and just incredible resilience. Let's dive right in. So, I want you to ask yourself, what single city could possibly be worth a 200-year war? Seriously, try to imagine a prize so magnificent that it drove three separate, massive empires into literal centuries of relentless bloodshed. This wasn't just some minor border skirmish. This was an absolute obsession that consumed entire generations of rulers. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the imperial prize itself. Then, we'll meet the three great factions. After that, we'll break down the 200-year struggle. And finally, we'll examine the true cost of all this ambition. Section 1. The Imperial Prize, the crown jewel of North India. To understand this, we need to look at what historians call the tripartite struggle. Basically, this was a massive triangular tug-of-war spanning the 8th to 10th century CE. You've got three powerhouse dynasties, the Gujarat Pratiharas, the Palas, and the Rashtrakutas. And the absolute center of this free-for-all? A city called Kannauj. For 2 whole centuries, this one single location dictated the foreign policy of almost the entire Indian subcontinent. It's just wild to think about. Now, you might be wondering, why Kannauj? Well, it wasn't just any ordinary city. Kannauj had reached peak importance under King Harshavardhana, who made it his grand imperial capital. But when he died in 647 CE, he didn't leave a strong successor, which created a huge power vacuum. Strategically, this place was a gold mine, sitting right in the super fertile Ganga-Yamuna Doab, offering rich agricultural land and major military advantages. Economically, it commanded these crazy prosperous trade routes that generated massive revenue. But here's the real kicker. Politically, holding Kannauj meant you were literally the ruler of North India. It was the ultimate symbol of legitimacy. Moving on to Section 2, the three great factions, the contenders for the throne. So a massive power vacuum opens up, and the greatest prize in India is up for grabs. Geographically, the board was set perfectly for a massive, multi-front war. Over in western and northern India, you've got the Gujarat Pratiharas operating out of Ujjain, featuring heavy hitters like Nagabhata II. Then looking east over Bengal and Bihar, you have the Pala Empire, led by formidable rulers like Dharmapala. And down south, positioned on the Deccan Plateau, are the Rashtrakutas, operating out of their capital, Manyaketa. All three wanted supremacy. All three believed Kannauj was their absolute destiny. Actually, let's pause here for a second because there's a really surprising contrast I want to point out. These empires weren't just one-dimensional military machines. Take the Palas, for example. While they were fighting these brutal, exhausting wars, they were incredibly devout patrons of Buddhism. They were actively funding massive, world-renowned centers of learning, like the famous Nalanda University. It just goes to show how these empires were sophisticated builders of knowledge, even while they were locked in centuries of combat. Which brings us to Section 3, the 200-year struggle, a cycle of conquest and retreat. So how exactly do three different empires fight over one city for 200 years? Well, the crucial thing to understand is that this wasn't one giant decisive battle. It was a deeply frustrating cyclical loop of hit-and-run warfare. Think of it like this. First, the Pratiharas and Palas clash for dominance. But before the winner can even get comfortable, the Rashtrakutas invade from the south and crush both of them. But then, incredibly, the Rashtrakutas just pack up and retreat because they're too far from home. This leaves the door wide open, and boom, the cycle repeats all over again with new rulers, decade after decade. And that brings us to what I like to call the Rashtrakuta dilemma. It is the greatest irony of this entire conflict. These guys had unmatched military might. Rulers like Dhruva easily invaded the north and defeating reigning kings. But they were cursed by impossible geography. Kannauj was simply way too far from their Deccan capital to administer permanently. They could effortlessly take the ultimate prize, but they could never, ever hold on to it. If we track this over time, it looks like a completely chaotic pendulum. It all kicks off back in 647 CE when Harsha's death creates that vacuum. By the late 8th century, the back and forth really heats up with the first Rashtrakuta intervention. We see the Palas install a puppet ruler around 770 to 810 CE, followed by the absolute peak of Rashtrakuta military dominance in the early 9th century. Just think about the sheer exhaustion of this spanning multiple lifetimes. Eventually, though, The Rashtrakutas get tied up with their own affairs down south, Pala power weakens, and the Pratiharas finally seize their moment in the 9th century. Ultimately, the cycle was broken. Under the rule of Mihira Bhoja, the Pratiharas solidified their dominance and became the strongest power in North India, even defending the region against Arab invasions. Mihira Bhoja finally made Kannauj his stable, permanent capital. After generations of relentless bloodshed, they had actually done it. They had finally secured the imperial prize. But at what price? Section 4. The cost of ambition. The devastating aftermath. Because look, this wasn't just a giant game of chess. This had profound, devastating, real-world consequences. 200 years of continuous warfare completely exhausted the militaries of all three dynasties. And the fighting happened right on the land that fueled their economies. Constant battles severely damaged agriculture and completely disrupted trade. Plus, with the central kings constantly marching off to war, local feudatories back home started seizing power. We see this massive, destabilizing rise in feudalism, and the empires literally started to fragment from the inside out. And all of this internal weakening, all of this massive fragmentation, leads us directly to one single devastating year, 1018 CE. In 1018 CE, Mahmud of Ghazni attacked and plundered Kannauj. Because these three factions had spent 2 centuries bleeding each other dry, the entire political structure of North India was fractured. An outside invader just swept in with minimal resistance and effectively ended Kannauj's era of imperial glory forever. The profound, tragic irony here is that the prize they spent 200 years fighting to protect was ultimately destroyed precisely because their fighting left them totally defenseless. Now, I don't want us to walk away thinking this entire era was just ashes and ruin, because it wasn't. Miraculously, even amidst all this chaos, these empires produced incredible cultural legacies. The Palas supported massive universities like Nalanda and Vikramashila. The Pratiharas promoted absolutely magnificent temple architecture. And the Rashtrakutas? They built the breathtaking Kailasa temple, an engineering marvel. So India's history was immeasurably enriched by these dynasties, even as their ambitions tore their political empires apart. So, looking back at the epic rise and fall of these 3 great empires, it leaves us with a huge question to ponder. Does the relentless pursuit of absolute power always lead to mutual ruin? It's a fascinating, kind of sobering piece of history to reflect on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes